It is wonderful to be here in Austin to share a little Juneteenth history. I often use the analogy of a green salad. The lettuce and tomatoes are the stories that you hear of the founding fathers and early settlers. But our American history salad has croutons, bell peppers, hot peppers, other ingredients that add a little more flavor. So today we're going to flavor up the history a little bit with Juneteenth. Many people are talking about Juneteenth. I think of Juneteenth like this baby that was born, right? The story. It has grown up, gone off to college, received its bachelor's, master's, PhD, traveled the world. But the birthplace of Juneteenth will always be Galveston, Texas. That is the place in which Gordon Granger came and made the announcement. There's no documentation that he did any public reading of the announcement anywhere, whether it be Ashtonville or down at the Ashton building. But the fact that he came to the island is basically the basics of that. So before I get too far into it, I do want to make a couple of announcements. In October, in Galveston, we will have a annual meeting for Juneteenth planners and directors. So during the month of June, directors and planners have Juneteenth events in their communities all over the country. And there's a national group that has been doing a national conference where anyone that hosts or plans Juneteenth activities are invited to come. So we'll be in Galveston October 14th through 16th. There will also be a pageant for the National Miss Juneteenth. Last year's winner, or the first winner, was Sanaa Gay from Delaware. And she competed in Memphis, Tennessee in 2020 during the pandemic. And then in October of 2021, Acia Spade from Portland, Oregon, she won. So she's the current National Miss Juneteenth. She'll be in Galveston Memorial Day weekend and then coming back in October. So I want to put a little plug there to visit Galveston in non-peak season in October. All right. So when I think about this history, our American history, it's kind of like a home. So it's an old home, and it's in need of rehabilitation. Renovation. The home had wiring, plumbing, but that wiring is old. The plumbing is old. We've had a few little flash fires, and the house hasn't burned down, but the electrician has come out and said, you need to rewire the house or it might burn down. The plumber has said, hey, these pipes rusted, old. They were good when they were installed, but we need to repipe and replumb it. So the work that we're doing now is to retell the story and be more inclusive of all of the history and those that contributed to this history. As we add flavor to it, we're renovating this house because we're all on the deed. We all are part of this American house, and we want it to survive because we have to live in this house and for future generations. So it's my job now to crawl under the house, past the dead animals, past the ants, get dirty, rewire the house, replumb it so that my children and future generations don't have to do this work. And then we can paint it and make it real pretty. But the hard work is going under the house and doing the wiring and the plumbing. So the hard work of changing the narrative around Juneteenth is difficult, but it's something that we have to do to tell the truth of what actually happened. So what actually happened? Let's start with the very basics. If you let me set this down for a second. If you think of a child that's going into kindergarten or first grade, they're basically learning how to count. They're learning their letters. Those are the very basic things you need to learn how to read and to learn how to add and multiply. So Gordon Granger coming to Galveston is the very basic version of the Juneteenth story. He did not ride into Galveston on a horse, of course. He came by ship. There's a story that he went to Ashton Villa and made this announcement, from the balcony. It's a romanticized version. It's not so much about the location of where an announcement was made, except the fact that the message of freedom had finally been enforced, because the Emancipation Proclamation, as we said in the documentary, the news of it had been here in Texas as early as the fall of 1862. So the enforcement of it was just delayed. So that's the very basic story. But what's behind the rest of it? Why Galveston? And why does Texas need to lead? Texas has always led with regards to the story of Juneteenth. There are many days, freedom days, January 1st with the Emancipation Proclamation, April 15th or 16th in Washington, D.C. areas considered an Emancipation Day. In Florida, May 20th is kind of like their version of Juneteenth. Soldiers got there on May 20th, but the soldiers were basically going down the East Coast into Florida and moving west. And then they finally get to Texas, which was the last major state west of New Orleans, and Galveston, the last major port. So some believe that Galveston was kind of just an accident. Like the soldiers were ordered to go further south, which is true. Grant had ordered General Sheridan to send forces to South Texas to shore up the border because they were concerned about the French coming up and maybe trying to take Texas through Mexico. So he wanted to secure that border. Galveston had a natural deep water port. It was the commercial center of Texas. It's hard to think of it today because you have major metropolitan areas like Dallas, Fort Worth, the greater Houston area, the Houston Ship Channel and all that. But none of that was in existence in the mid-1800s in the early settling of Texas. Galveston was a major player in this commercial development. So the Union absolutely wanted to have control of the port, and they actually had control of the port in the fall of 1862. And then the Battle of Galveston, January 1st, 1863, returned control of Galveston back to the Confederacy until the end of the Civil War. So people say, well, the news was late coming into Galveston. Well, in this book, and one of the things that I try to do, if you're the smartest person in the room, you got to find you another room. You got to find you another room and get around smarter people. So I'm going to recommend several books of individuals that have done amazing work to do this research. So one of them is DJ Norman Cox, Donald Norman Cox. And in it, he deals with the popular myths and forgotten facts about Juneteenth. So when people talk about the news was late, well, in it, he mentions between September of 1862 and December of 1864, at least 125 newspapers had written something about the Emancipation Proclamation, and the news was spreading. 125 newspapers. And not only does he tell you that, then he cites each newspaper source in the book. So you can go read about it yourself. So you say, well, the enslaved people could not read. Well, they could hear. And so if the enslavers are reading this news and talking about it, they would have heard them discussing it, and they would have heard them discussing, I don't care what Lincoln says, you're never going to be free. I own you. I own your great aunt. Y'all are not going anywhere. All right? So I own your children. I don't care what Lincoln says. He's not my president, because they have the Confederate States of America. They formed a whole new country. So Lincoln was not their president. So they did not recognize this Emancipation Proclamation as something they had to adhere to. And if not for the soldiers that came into Galveston, they would have tried to delay it as long as possible. The other thing DJ Norman Cox talks about, there's several myths. One is the Ashton Villa myth, that Granger went there. Ed Cotham is quoted here, and Jamie Durham, historian with the Galveston Historical Foundation, that they have not been able to turn up any evidence or any record that anything happened at Ashton Villa. So what really happened? Granger was over in Alabama. Grant had ordered Sheridan to secure the border, and then General Sheridan, Philip Sheridan, had also ordered Gordon Granger to go to Galveston. So it wasn't that Granger was headed south to the southern tip of the border. He was actually headed directly to Galveston. There are some that say, well, Granger came into Galveston and didn't even get off the boat. That doesn't make any sense either. Like, why is he just gonna stay on the boat? He set up his headquarters at the Osterman building on the southwest corner of 22nd and Strand. This is documented that he set up their headquarters there. Granger did not write or sign General Order Number 3. He had an officer under him named Major Frederick Emory. Emory is the one that actually wrote General Order Number 3 and signed it. Now, in that order, the first part of it that states that all slaves are free, in the end, advising them to remain at their present homes and work for wages, were direct instructions from General Sheridan to Granger to include that. But in the middle, there is a quote that says, "This involves an absolute equality." That was specifically penned, we believe, by Major Frederick Emory because he had been an abolitionist that had worked for a newspaper before he joined the Union Army. So that absolute equality language is specifically there because of Major Frederick Emory. This is how we get the message. Now, once that message is given to the enslaved people, there in Galveston, the U.S. Custom House had a printing press, and they began printing these 5 general orders and this message of General Order Number 3. And as they printed these, the soldiers then took them and spread that message throughout Texas. So we believe because of the ability to print that and get this message out by telegram and then by these handbills to post them all over, that's how this message spread. So the oral history of the enslaved individuals and this taking the message out from Galveston into the interior of Texas over several months. So there's no Instagram, no Twitter, no text message, no WhatsApp, so they wasn't able to just send messages out, but they did send telegraph off. And on June 20th, one of the telegraph states that Galveston is now occupied by colored troops. Nowhere in the history books when I was in the 4th grade, 7th grade, high school, college, did anybody share this information. This is part of rewiring the house. This is part of sharing new information. And the reason I pull these books up is so that you could go look it up for yourself. So you don't just have to take my word for it that I just made it up. The other thing in this book, Juneteenth by Ed Cotham, he kind of gives a lot more detail in the story behind the celebration, in the military records and things. He does a deep dive into how they ended up coming into Galveston. And this is important because many people are telling the Juneteenth story now. And to me, it's like reading a book on swimming. You could read the book, but eventually you're gonna have to get in the water. You're gonna have to go through the physical experience of getting in the water and learning how to hold your breath and learning how to breathe and swim. You cannot just read a book and automatically know how to jump in that pool and swim. So when you come to Galveston, you're in the pool, you're in the water. You get to go by the sites that we're talking about on Pier 21, the southwest corner of 22nd and Strand where the Osterman building was, over to the U.S. Custom House at 502 20th Street, to Broadway and Reedy Chapel at 2015 Broadway, where the news was posted at the Colored Church on Broadway, which we have reports of that. And then also Ashton Villa, where many celebrations have been held to commemorate Juneteenth. And this is an important part of the story because there's a statue of Al Edwards there at Ashton Villa. And it is important that we tell the story of Representative Edwards, and that in 1979, he introduced House Bill 1016 that made Juneteenth a state holiday, Texas being the first. Texas has always been leading this conversation around Juneteenth and this message of freedom. But 100 years before that, Representative Robert Evans from Navasota, a black legislator, introduced a Juneteenth bill to make it a state holiday. in 1879. So it's not that people had not been trying, it just took until 1979 for it to finally pass. And it's not that the elders or ancestors hadn't been commemorating these events. Long before it was on the national calendar, long before it was on the state calendar, the elders commemorated the message that had been handed down to them for generations, that this is the freedom day that they chose for themselves. Officially, slavery did not end until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, but for the former enslaved of Texas, specifically Galveston, they took the message and spread it all throughout the state and all throughout the nation. So there is a push now that the United States colored troops came into Galveston, and then they took the messages about Galveston back to their communities. Well, some of them may have shared their experiences of all their battles, but the real push to make Juneteenth as well known as it was came from the everyday individuals and the 250,000 plus enslaved people of Texas, which was the last large territory. So there's also this narrative that Juneteenth relates to all the teen dates from the 13th through the 19th, or the June 14th date in Oklahoma, where it wasn't until 1866 that there were 5 treaties signed with the civilized nations that ended slavery in those territories. June 14th, 1866. So this was almost a year after Juneteenth. The reason we have Juneteenth is because you take the month June and the day 19th and tie it together Juneteenth, and that happened in Galveston. There's only 365 days in a year, right? So when you think about that, there are going to be major events that happen on certain days throughout history. So now everybody's looking up to see, oh, what's all these things that happened on June 19th? Abraham Lincoln actually signed a bill on June 19th, 1862, to end slavery in U.S. territories in 1862. Now people will take that and backdate it and say the June 19th event started in 1862. Like, no, it is not as though Sheridan told Granger, wait, go into Galveston on June 19th, and because of this event in 1862, I want you to do this event at the same day. No, the 1862 date is now tied to the 1865 date, and it's just coincidental, because of the events that happened in Galveston. So there'll be a lot of attempts to try to take the June 19th, the first Father's Day was June 19th, 1910. That's a lot of things that happen on June 19th. I know people born on June 19th, but June 19th and Juneteenth is specifically, let's get this foundation. This is back to the basics of counting 1 to 10 and learning your alphabets. It's because of Galveston. So Galveston is important to the story. So the other reason Galveston was important to the story is because the largest enslaver had his home in Galveston. Robert Mills and his brother David Mills owned 850 people. They had 7 plantations, 4 in Brazoria County, 2 in Matagorda County, and 1 in Fort Bend. This is important to the history because you see that this was the business center of Galveston County and of Texas, and many individuals, Samuel May Williams, Michael Menard, other individuals, early settlers, they had their business interests in Galveston. Well, they had their homes in Galveston, but they had their business interests throughout the state in several counties. So they owned land all over. Galveston was kind of a resort town, and that's where all the shipping went. So this is why it was so important for the Union to have control of Galveston and get the message to Galveston and to then spread it from Galveston out. Couple of other books that I do want to recommend. I Freed Myself by David Williams. The other part of the narrative and the story is that Granger kind of arrived by himself and made this big announcement, and that Abraham Lincoln is this great emancipator that freed these individuals that needed to be saved themselves. But the truth is, many of the enslaved people began running away prior to the Civil War. And then during the Civil War, if they made it to Union camps, They then began to form contraband camps. May 23rd, 1861, there were 3 men, Townsend, Baker, and Mallory, that ran to a Union camp. And when they got there, there was an attorney that became a officer named Benjamin Butler. And Butler made a decision in 1861 that was pivotal to the war. The Confederate officer sent a message to him and said, look, because of the fugitive slave law, you must return the enslaved people in your camp. And he, being an attorney, sent a message back saying that you are a foreign nation. We are at war. And because you're a foreign nation, you're not under our Constitution. Therefore, we do not have to return the property. It became contraband of war. This is pivotal because as more enslaved people ran away, hundreds of thousands of them, 2 things were happening. It was weakening the South's labor force, and it was strengthening the North and the Union. This was pivotal in the war for the Union to gain strength and to win. And if not for the United States colored troops, the Union would not have won, not just for their physical presence, but for their intellectual information and knowledge, their intel about the South. So as an example, one of the leading historians, Harry Jones, he passed in 2018, and he was one of the people that I learned about the USCT from in probably 2008 or 9. And Harry wasn't a big fan of Juneteenth because he felt like, it gave too much credit to Granger, which he was correct. But I can't let him just talk down about Galveston and Juneteenth. Like we're always going to say Galveston, Juneteenth is important. So, but Harry talked about the fact in one of his presentations how the information that the former enslaved had in certain territories, like they would say, you got to go down this creek or river a mile or 2 and find a low spot and cross behind the enemy and then come up underneath them. Well, the only way that the Union soldiers could have known about that territory is to get information from people that lived in the area. And there were also enslaved people that did not escape that were helping prisoners of war and spies by sharing information with Union soldiers. So this narrative around Juneteenth, there were many people that helped to make this Juneteenth event happen, and they worked to free themselves. Another Juneteenth book is Annette Gordon Reed's book on Juneteenth. And like Men of War, about the black troops from 1862 to 1865. One of the things I like pointing out in this book is that General Sheridan states in early January of 1866 that his Lone Star contingent was at 6,500 white soldiers, 19,768 black soldiers. So that's a 3-to-1 ratio. 75% of the forces in Texas were black troops. Now, earlier, Grant had wanted to put up a much larger presence of Union forces in Texas. But they did not end up needing that many soldiers. There were going to be tens of thousands of soldiers that had to come into Texas, but they ended up not sending that many into Texas because the Texas leaders were also actively trying to negotiate that they could control things here in Texas. Things are different in Texas, right? Texas is still different, all right? Come and take it. And my theme now is come and take this Juneteenth narrative from Galveston. We're ready. Come and take. But the military leaders in May of '65 had gone over to New Orleans and reached terms of agreement. I think it was May 25th, late May. And Galveston actually surrendered June 2nd. So before June 19th, Galveston had already surrendered, and on June 5th, the United States flag was raised at the U.S. Custom House, and Galveston was back under control, but we still had some unfinished business in which Granger came in and issued the 5 general orders, writing 1 and 2, and then 3, 4, and 5, of course, Major Frederick Emory. So this is why Galveston is so important to this narrative. This major port city spread the message from the island out into the interior. And those individuals like Mills, by controlling 7 plantations, if you go to Galveston and you deal with those leaders, that message could then trickle down into other communities and areas. And then other major towns that they went to, the soldiers, San Antonio, Austin, Houston, they went out from Galveston to these major cities. So Texas is going to lead in making sure that the rest of the nation knows this. In October, when the National Juneteenth Conference is in Galveston, Juneteenth planners and directors will come from all over the country into Galveston, and we will show them what Galveston has to offer. There's a great deal of research and information at the Galveston and Texas History Center at the Rosenberg Library that I would encourage individuals, if you, much of that information is digitized online, but you could come to Galveston and do that research. And before I forget, another person that was very instrumental in Juneteenth becoming a national holiday is Dr. Ronald Myers. Dr. Myers was the founder and director of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation. He traveled many years between 94, 97 to 2018 when he passed away, of building a national network of Juneteenth planners and directors. He came into to Texas. The first time I started working with him was probably 2007, and he was trying to work with some locals here, but they really didn't embrace what he was doing. At the time, there were probably 25 states that were recognizing Juneteenth as a state holiday. Dr. Myers helped to get it in over 40 states. In addition to Texas, he helped legislation in over 40 states, I believe 43. Before he passed in 2018, and he's kind of largely been left out of this narrative. And when Doc left Galveston, or when he first got kind of brushed off by some of that, some of his national work began to push that there's more to it than just Galveston, which there was more to it and more backstory. But that's kind of where this national narrative that the story is bigger than Galveston. And it is bigger than Galveston. This story of freedom is bigger than all of us individually. And anyone that loves America, loves freedom, equality, they have to love this Juneteenth story. Juneteenth is like a freedom birthday. So you have July 4th is a birthday for the country, and Juneteenth is a freedom birthday for the former enslaved. So I am going to open it up for a couple of questions. But I want to point out a couple of other things. I'm a walking advertisement, right? So 1619, everybody knows 400 years of slavery. You know, we've been stuck here in the United States. First of all, it wasn't 400 years of slavery because it ended in 1865. And if you just do 1619, 1865, that's 246. Even though slavery evolved in some areas, as Brian Stevenson said, it didn't really end. It just evolved with convict leasing, mass incarceration. That's a whole nother conversation for another day. But 1528 is the date that the first non-native enslaved individual arrived in Galveston. Again, tying Galveston to this history of enslavement for almost 500 years. They were, Esteban Vinico was part of a Spanish exploration. They were captives for 5 years of the natives. They finally escaped, got down to Mexico. He was part of the exploration. He learned to speak several languages. So he was actually negotiating with the natives and actually the one communicating with them. Some believe he was killed by the natives. There are others that believe that he just went and lived with the natives. So if he was enslaved in one group and he was able to communicate with the other group, I would like to think that he just left and went and lived with them. I mean, it's going to be better over there than here. So that history, that 500-year history from 1528 to now. Juneteenth Legacy Project. I'm the co-chair of the Juneteenth Legacy Project, along with my other co-chair, Ms. Sheridan Lorenz, who helped to organize the nonprofit organization in the fall of 2020. And we completed a major mural project in Galveston. So you have to come down to Galveston. This is a photo of it. All right. This was one of our programs from last year, and then we had the Neocultural Center as our fiscal sponsor, and they're the nonprofit organization running the Juneteenth Legacy Project headquarters and the neocultural headquarters in the old Galveston Square building on the Strand, which is right by the mural and basically ground zero. So I want to thank her for coming out today and supporting me here in Austin. But without the help of Miss Lorenz and her family that owned the building and the parking lot there, we wouldn't have been able to get the mural done. So we want to thank her for that. Right across the street from the mural was this old auction house owned by John Seabrook Sidner. Maya Angelou has a quote: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." We cannot change 1528, 1619, 1776, 1865, but it is my hope that we do the work to rewire the house, replumb the house, to change the energy of the 2200 block, to tell new stories and expand the narrative to make this history salad a little more flavorful. So I want you to jump in the water and ask questions so that we can have a little conversation around this history. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentation thus far, and I'll be here for a while to kind of answer some questions.